The ancient land of Israel is a testimony, an evidence of the greatness of what God did in that country, a testimony to the truth of the words that we find in the pages of the Bible. Within Christianity, it often appears that the whole Christian faith was something brand new that suddenly appeared on the scene. Recent research, however, indicates that that's not true. Rather, God had already prepared a whole movement of people, a world of ideas, a philosophy, if you will, which anticipated Christianity. At Qumran, a settlement of an ancient people called the Essenes, we find a remarkable number of similarities between that ancient group who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls and early Christianity. We're sitting here on the side of a cliff, the edge of the Judean wilderness. Below us, the Dead Sea, stretching to the south and to the east of us, the hills of Moab, the country of Jordan today over there in the distance, just in the haze, the city of Jericho. Behind us, caves and cliffs and clefts in the rock. And below us, the community we know as Qumran, the place of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Not so long ago, in fact, beginning in 1947, in these caves around us, caves down below there by Qumran, the caves up above us here, and in the wadis around, discoveries were made of very ancient scrolls, which in a way have revolutionized our understanding of the Bible and of the people who lived in the New Testament period of the Bible times, and have even helped our understanding of what the Bible says about Jesus, though we certainly aren't going to say there's any evidence Jesus was ever here or was associated with this. But let's set the stage for what this is all about. About 200 years before our era, 200 years before the birth of Jesus, the people who were ruling in Jerusalem were Jewish people called the Hasmoneans. We also know them as the Maccabees. And during the process of that period of time, without going into all the details, a high priest was appointed, a head of the temple authority in Jerusalem, that was not acceptable to everybody. There were some who thought that he did not have the qualifications to be a high priest and that he didn't belong there. So a group of very religious people that we know as the Essenes moved out of their city, away from their temple, and came out to places like this to set up what they considered to be alternative or appropriately holy ways of worshiping God. Their view was that the temple structure in Jerusalem and all of the people connected with it were illegitimate. They didn't belong there. And so they came out here to isolate themselves from their community, from their society, and establish what they considered to be the true form of religion. The Essenes built this community apparently about 200 BC, and they were here from that time until there was a very, very bad earthquake in this area in 31 BC, and that community down there was basically destroyed. It remained empty till around 4 BC or so, when Herod the Great died, and Herod's son Archelaus became the king, or the ruler in this area, and they came back here and reestablished this settlement. They stayed here in that community from that time, about 4 BC, until 68 AD, when the Roman army was coming down from the Galilee, from having destroyed places like Gamla, on their way to Jerusalem, and they came through this area and destroyed the community. And at that point, as far as we know, the Essenes disappeared from history. The Essenes were people who believed that they had been called to come out into the desert, to isolate themselves, to make their lives right with God, to create a new system of purity and honor to God, so that when the Messiah arrived, which they expected very shortly, that he would find people who were prepared to reestablish the true priesthood and the true kingship of David. And so they came out here to find holiness. They lived an ascetic kind of life. In fact, they probably didn't live in those buildings you see down there. Those were community buildings, dining hall, writing rooms possibly. They probably lived in huts or in tents or maybe even in caves in the area around and simply used that as their community center and the place where their various activities went on. They wrote extensively on copper, on leather, and on parchment. They wrote copies of Bible books. In fact, almost all the Bible books that are in our Old Testament appear in scroll form from these people. They wrote documents about their order, about how to live the Essene lifestyle. They wrote documents about the coming of the Messiah and the new age that was about to arrive and the exciting new era that they were prepared to go into. They wrote extensively, and for some reason, they would hide the documents in the caves around this area. Now, some think they hid the documents because they had worn out and they had gotten old. And you remember in the Jewish tradition, when religious things get old, you don't burn them or throw them away, you appropriately dispose of them. It's possible, some think, as the Romans came through here. Those Essenes believed that they would escape maybe that Roman attack, but they wanted to hide their very precious scrolls and documents. Fortunately for us, those caves, for the most part, stayed hidden up until about 1947. A couple of Bedouin came to this area. They discovered a cave. What had been found were scrolls, documents dating back from the time of Jesus. Now, that has been a tremendous find for a number of reasons. One is because it provides us an insight on the theological thinking of people like this from Jesus' time. Another thing that it gave us is before those scrolls were found, the oldest documents we had of the Hebrew Old Testament date back only about 1,000 years. And so people ask, if those oldest copies we have date back only 1,000 years, how do we know that Isaiah, who was written 1,500 years before that, is accurate? And lo and behold, as these scrolls were found and people began to look at them, they discovered that with very few exceptions, the Old Testament documents we have 1,000 years later confirm that the Bible really has changed very, very little. And I think that's a real affirmation, a real confidence for us to know that God has always protected his Bible. But what's most fascinating, I think, is to discover that this community provides us some insights on how people were thinking at Jesus' time. And I'd like to suggest that what we see here and what we read in those very old scrolls is remarkably similar to what many of the early Christians were teaching and thinking. Now, I want to be very careful here. I'm not suggesting they were the early Christians. I don't believe that to be the case. I think this was a Jewish community that existed here and also up in Jerusalem and in other places. I think they were attempting to purify the Jewish system of worship, but in the process, they began to sound certain theological concepts that are remarkably close to what we think and what we believe. And I'm excited about that because it suggests that Christianity didn't suddenly drop out of heaven, but rather that God had prepared a very fertile seedbed for this faith that he was about to plant here. And a lot of the ideas and concepts come out of this particular community. First of all, they used language that would sound very similar. They called themselves the New Israel. They said, we've come out into the desert to prepare the way of the Lord. And I had always understood the way of the Lord to mean like a road. But the way of the Lord, to their understanding, was a system of obedience, God's way, in other words, God's walk. They thought of themselves as living at the end of time, that the Messiah would appear at any moment, that they're at the end of the age. And that kind of language suggests a similarity to things that appear in the New Testament when Jesus talks about the end of the age and that before these things happen, this generation will not have passed away, and concepts like that.